This is Views. This program is intended to encourage you along with pastors, scholars, speakers, and Bible-believing scientists by giving them an opportunity to do what? To share with you their views according to their prayerful research and study of the Bible. Why? Well, to burden our understanding, the viewers, the believers, to challenge our limitations and to inspire our spirits for deeper understanding of the Word of our infinite Jesus Christ. And on that note, it gives me pleasure to have with me a dear friend and someone who I really admire, Dr. Sigve Tonstad. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. This is episode 2 of 3, by the way. Last week we aired part 1. This is part 2, and there's 1/3 episode will air next week. So check our website for listing times and repeat times so you can enjoy the discussion with Dr. Tonstad. He is, though, the author on several books, but the one we're in subject today or in discussion, God of Sense and Traditions of Nonsense. Wow, that's a mouthful title, and clearly there's a lot of thoughtfulness behind this title. Let's recap that again. What brought you up to this title or to this research?
Let's just say what that title is meant to convey. It's meant to convey that God speaks to us and informs us, illuminates us in a way that, yes, we need to have faith, but it isn't blind faith, it is informed faith. It is in some ways evidence-based. The main evidence, of course, is the story of Jesus. So we should not think that God invites us into a sort of dark chamber. God communicates to us and in some ways helps us to see things, helps us to understand the reality we live in and so on. And then the second part of my book title, Traditions of Nonsense, reflects the fact that even deep in Christianity there has been a shift, has been a commitment to portray God as someone we cannot understand. Human beings are very, very small. God is very, very great. And God does some things that we cannot understand. Let's say the problem of eternal suffering. Well, I cannot understand that, but I accept it. Well, I think that is an element in what I call the traditions of nonsense that ought to be taken out.
So I see in your title, God is the perfection, to be honest. And then down below where we are is where the nonsense comes in. It's part of the human race.
So there will be many things we will not understand, but God is not asking of us to accept that, a large portion of the human race will be, suffer forever. There is in the Bible an end to suffering, and how God brings that about is a major element in my book.
I'm going to throw this a personal challenge that I have when we deal with people in the workplace and vendors outside in the world where you get invited to places, and every now and then you run into someone who's non-believer but claims to be a believer and begin blaming God on all the sufferings in life. Why did God allow destruction of this nation? Why did God allow the destruction of this particular race and so on? Give them a little bit of your thoughts on that, because I'd love to take this segment and share it with them.
Well, I'll say that people who ask those kinds of questions are in their right to do so, because that is the big question in many ways of human reality. And maybe some people will be surprised to discover that those kinds of questions are asked within the Bible. It's not just a question we bring to the Bible, or as though nobody ever thought about that and the Bible would rather not go there. The Bible would very much like to go there. It is a big concern, a big question, why God seems to be so permissive, why. And yes, in the early one of the earliest critiques of Christian faith was done by a non-Christian philosopher in the 2nd century, Celsus. Celsus, we don't know very much about him, but he wrote a book called On the True Doctrine. And he doesn't like, the idea that we believe in a God who allows things. God shouldn't be, God should be in charge. He should fix things. And he is especially offended by the Christian, notion of Jesus, who himself seems to be kicked around.
Right.
Jesus is kicked around by the devil. You can't, that doesn't make sense to Celsus, but that is in some ways a very major element in the Christian story.
But there has to be some books written for those who have those questions, and I think your book will cover good portion of their curiosity or their lack of understanding.
My book interacts very broadly with the literature, with these kinds of questions, whether they come from philosophy, from literature, and sure, the Bible. So there is a big portion of my book deals in Bible stories, but I do look at other questions too. And as we talked about in our previous program, I am the position from which we address these issues is the Holocaust of the 20th century, which is probably the biggest, most vexing reality of our time.
Yeah, especially when it's considered modern days.
Yes.
Where man was more knowledgeable and you think would not commit such atrocity. Yes. But it did happen. How do you get a whole race or nation to be misled by one man? It's more than the man. It's got to be the dark forces that help that movement.
Well, yes, okay, now we're going into, in some ways a treacherous territory, but let's just say one of the challenges of the cosmic conflict perspective that I outline in my book is that theologians, New Testament theologians in general in the 20th century, they gradually abandoned the notion that evil is personified. So there are some things we can't believe in anymore. We can't believe in Satan. We can't believe, in a demonic reality. And some of the voices who were most loudest, most influential, were German theologians, and they pushed that idea, right while these terrible things were happening. This notion that the New Testament needs to be demythologized. Right. You need to take mythology out of it because we are modern people. We cannot believe in such things anymore. And I say, maybe the New Testament needs to be demythologized. But if you think you need to do it, wait. Don't do it right now. Don't do it while the trains are running to Auschwitz. Because as the trains are running to Auschwitz and children are thrown into the fire and, millions are gassed,
late.
Well, maybe you should use the notion of the demonic for that. If there is no devil, maybe you should invent him, maybe, just maybe, the New Testament and its notion of good, evil, demonic, divine, maybe, just maybe, the New Testament was onto something that is not, that is not in want of empirical proof in our time. There is evidence for it. So I hold it against those New Testament people whose work I otherwise am quite ready to admire. I hold it against them that they took the notion of evil, the sort of personification of evil that New Testament talks about, that they took that out of the equation. I want to put it back in.
Well, and I agree with you. I think it should, because we all in our lives have experienced something or another that was imposed by the dark force. And there's a greater power in heaven that pulled you out of that stage. So for us not to think Satan does exist, it's almost, you better not even believe completely.
Well, it is in some ways an embarrassing errand, you know, to want to restore and create sort of traction for that kind of belief. You know, maybe that's, you know, who wants to be, you know, a spokesperson for the evil side of things. But the gain of that, the gain of that is that, first of all, that it has explanatory power. You know, it reflects maybe reality as it really is, and the other benefit is that the demonic side has misrepresented God, right. And then maybe we can restore to God some of the dignity, the beauty, the attractiveness of God that the demonic has taken away.
It's almost sometimes they try to impersonate who God is and present false image of him.
And that's, yes, misrepresentation of God is a very big element here, and yes, that is, you know, that gets clearer as we pursue that theme.
I worry about the last days, but we'll talk about that maybe in your last episode. Let's get back to your book. In part 1, your book has the title, Bursts of Sense. What do you mean by that?
Well, yeah, but so that is really my second part. So my second part, Bursts of Sense. So let me back off a little and sort of look at it at a distance. Right. My first 5 chapters are framing chapters. I show from experience, history, philosophy, Bible, the cosmic paradigm, the cosmic perspective on good and evil. And then on the bursts of sense, I do specific biblical stories that, you know, why did I choose that story, not that story? Why, you know, what was the selection criteria? And the selection criteria is I chose the best ones. I chose the most important ones, the pivotal stories. So, yes, I have Adam and Eve. How could you bypass that? Yes, I have Cain and Abel. Adam and Eve, in that story, is the first discussion about God, the first discussion of theology. In Cain and Abel, you have the first murder. I have Abraham. In Abraham, you have the first discussion with God. Should not the judge of the earth do what is right? So here is Abraham, a believer in God, asking God questions and asking, you know, basically saying, God, I am holding you to a certain standard, you know.
Right.
And then I have many other stories. I have Moses, I have Elijah, I have the concubine in Judges 19.
Talk to us about that.
Who never makes it, you know, into, you know, nobody ever talks about the concubine in Judges 19. But in a post-Holocaust theology, she needs to help us. Wow.
The Job story, you have really brought it out to life.
Well, if we could say a few more things about the concubine, since Job is famous, but the concubine in Judges 19, she doesn't have many, you know, there is not, you know, very many in her fan club. I am a member in her fan club, you know, and I'm so grateful that the Bible gave us that story, you know, that story that has nothing redemptive about it. She is a victim. She's, you know, concubine to a priestly figure, a Levite. He prostitutes her. She leaves home. She goes, you know, she leaves him. She goes back to her home. He goes after her. She doesn't have many options. You know, she's a vulnerable person. So he comes and gets her, and she goes back to there, you know, to where he lives. And then on the way, in the ugliest part of that story, the house where they stay is attacked. She is brought out. The Levite, he forces her out over her objections. He pushes her out to the mob. She is gang raped all night. In the morning, she crawls to the house where they are staying. And she expires on the threshold there, her hands reaching for the door. And then, he gets up in the morning, he says, "Come, let's leave now." It's a very ugly story. It's a story of prayers that go unanswered. It's a story where God seems to be absent. And yes, there is nothing redemptive in the story, except that for the 20th century, millions and millions of people experienced what it meant to be the concubine in Judges 19.
You seems to see things in the Bible through a different lens, which is good.
So give it to the Bible. Give it to the Bible, at least in that story. I asked my students, my medical students at Loma Linda University, I asked them, is this story bad enough to serve, the purpose of representing the sense of being abandoned, that God doesn't seem to intervene, that you pray and, prayers are not answered, And yes, they say, I say, do you need to go outside the Bible to find a story that is bad enough? And they say, no, this story is bad enough.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. How long have you been teaching at Loma Linda University?
I have been teaching here since 2007. And I have been working in, medical work, also in pastoral and in some ways evangelistic work in church in Norway. So I have tried to communicate the Bible to unchurched, to people who are generally secular, and to people who ask the kind of questions I am addressing in my book.
Your students, do you find them, being medical students, do you find the gravity of these discussions has an impact on their lives or their careers?
I think the approach we have in my course, God and Human Suffering, which is a course that is taught in various ways by my colleagues and myself, but I do think that my approach is resonating. Yes, definitely, and yes, I am committed to, in some ways, a narrower way. I do teach them a cosmic conflict perspective on the reality of evil. And students, they are not in doubt that is what I'm teaching them.
In your chapter on the Gospel of John, you drew a line from the wedding to the cross. Can you explain briefly how you see that line?
It is a very strange line, but there is a line. So how is it? Jesus comes on stage in the Gospel of John at a wedding in Cana. They run out of wine.
Right.
It's a rather trivial problem.
Yes.
The world has bigger problems than running out of wine. But at that wedding, Jesus supplies what was lacking. How much is it? 480 gallons? So it's a lot of wine, just abundance. Well, it's a happy occasion, and he solved the problem. And then, but as he proceeds to perform this miracle, he says to his mother, "My hour has not yet come. My hour has not yet come." And the Gospel of John keeps you posted on the hour that is coming. The hour is the cross. And then when we get to that point in the story in John chapter 12, Jesus will say, "The hour has come." Now, but already in chapter 2 at the wedding, we were served notice of the hour. So my question is, we go from the wedding to the cross. There is clearly a line because there is awareness of the cross at the wedding. But the wedding is a happy occasion. The cross must be sad. The cross must be, you're high up here at the wedding. You go down, in the dark valley of the cross. Mm-hmm. But that's not how the gospel, what the Gospel of John means to tell you. It means to tell us this. I'm simplifying it.
Yes.
God is a giving person. Abundance, wine, happy people. And God is giving without limit, because at the cross he gives himself. And out came blood and water in the Gospel of John. And blood and water are symbols of abundance, of generosity. So we have a generous God at the wedding. We have a generous God at the cross, a giving God. And we have a God in the Gospel of John who was misrepresented and made out to be an ungenerous person, who doesn't give things. So when Jesus goes to the cross, he says, now is the judgment of this world. Now the prince of this world will be thrown out. And this means that now we will see evidence of the giving God who was always there, but wasn't always seen to be a giving person. There is a line from the wedding to the cross, and when you get to the cross, don't feel too sad. The Gospel of John enables us to look at Jesus on the cross without having to turn our eyes away.
That's powerful.
It's kind of amazing.
At one point, did you see that part come into clarity?
Well, I was reading the Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky, who has written a book, The Brothers Karamazov. It's a very influential book. It's one of the most influential books ever written. My chapter 2 in the book and my chapter 18 in the book actually deal with aspects of the problem of suffering as that problem is illuminated in the Brothers Karamazov. But in one of the chapters in the Brothers Karamazov, there is one of the brothers, Alyosha, whose mentor has died. The mentor is a priest. And the mentor has always said to Alyosha that Jesus, when he came to serve men's joy. He who loves human beings loves their joy. And the wedding was, Alyosha's mentor said that because he had understood the wedding, the idea, the story, the meaning of the wedding. Dostoevsky, who lived from 1820 to 1881, he died when he was 61 years old. For Seventh-day Adventists, his dates overlap exactly with the dates of James White, who was an important person in the Adventist church. But Dostoevsky's favorite book of all literature was the Gospel of John. He understood it quite well.
And that's when deeper understanding was revealed.
Yes, and I
connected.
So I picked up that understanding of the line, the sort of givingness of God in the Gospel of John. Some of that I pick it up actually from a text that is not as familiar maybe as it ought to be to people who love the Bible. Dostoevsky was a keen reader of the Gospel of John. What can I say?
No, that's wonderful. Jesus' suffering also, it occurred. I mean, he suffered as well. There was no immunity for him to be on earth. Was that necessary for the Lord to show that this is part of this?
Well, everyone wants to talk about stuff about necessity around the death of Jesus. So the Gospel of John makes that story more simple. God has been misrepresented by the father of the lie. John chapter 8, verse 44, the father of the lie, who misrepresents God, making God seem like God is a person who loves prohibition, who is cruel, who is detached.
Right.
And Jesus comes into the world as the revealer, who is, giving us evidence that God is not the way that the other side has misrepresented him. And so the death of Jesus in the Gospel of John has a revelatory function. It makes us see God as a giving person. I mean, that's,
right.
So necessity, yes, there is a necessity to it, but I'm just sometimes anxious that we are going to drag too much of the theological tradition into this.
Right.
And you see what I do with the theological tradition.
In your book, you go from Old Testament to New Testament, back and forth. You show a lot of parallel there, apparently.
Yes, I have, stories from the Old Testament, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, 2 chapters on Abraham, 1 chapter on the concubine in Judges 19. I have Elijah, I have Moses, I have a strange story in 1 Kings 13, and then we have the book of Job. Before we transition to the New Testament, Jesus' temptation story, Jesus in the cross in the Gospel of John, and then I have a chapter on the Apostle Paul.
We have a few minutes left to this program, so we're going to narrow down our question. When you finish writing this book, you look back at yourself and your knowledge and your discoveries. What do you feel? What comes to mind? Accomplishment, discoveries, closeness to God. How would you describe that conclusion?
Well, last time we talked about the sense of feeling spoken to, and that is really the main thing. That these texts have in some ways required of me to speak for them. They have spoken to me to an extent that I would, they told me they wanted to be spoken for. and so my reward is really done in the process of thinking, studying, and writing. And writing is in some ways hard work, and in some ways it is only as I have written about these stories that they become mine.
Right.
I own them now. And so yes, I would like to share it, I'd like to others to get into this. But for me, I have in some ways already had my reward.
You felt it. If you ever want to, or wish, or envy Dr. Tonstad, or what and how much he knows, believe me, it's in his book. Get your copy. It'd be good study material, a good insight look into your years of studies and experience, but also a good way to look into what God has for his people and how he stands by them at all times, because it seems like God always prevails at the end of everything. Dr. Tonstad, thank you for being with us today. Folks, there's a third part to this series. It'll be airing next week. Make sure you visit our website, LLBN.tv. Check out the repeat times or the air times. And hopefully, when we end part 3, there'll be a lot more from Dr. Tonstad on LLBN through other programs. But this is all the time we have. I want to encourage you, the faithful, the viewers, to pray and study the Word of God for yourself, as we all should. And let the Holy Spirit guide you for greater understanding of His will and His everlasting heavenly kingdom. What a great promise we've been given by Him. We hope to see you next week here on Views.